A king made an offer so big it sounded unreal. 100 million, private jets waiting on the runway, palaces with gold-lined halls, anything he wanted, anything at all. The kind of offer that doesn't come twice. The kind of offer most people would accept before the sentence was finished. All Muhammad Ali had to do was say yes. No more financial worries, no more struggle, no more pressure to fight, speak out, or take uncomfortable positions. Just comfort, security, silence. Ali listened. He didn't ask for time to think. He didn't negotiate. He didn't wonder if he could take the money and keep his values. He answered immediately. No, not because the number wasn't big enough. Not because he didn't understand what he was being offered, and not because he hated wealth or success. He said no because some offers don't test your bank account, they test who you are. In that moment, Ali understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. Money can change your life, but it can also quietly change your voice. And once your voice no longer belongs to you, everything else you own comes at a cost. The room reportedly went still. An offer fit for legends, refused without hesitation. Not everyone turns down 100 million. In fact, almost no one does. But Ali wasn't trying to be rich. He was trying to be free. And freedom to him was worth more than any palace, any jet, or any king's approval. What would it take for you to walk away from 100 million? By the time Muhammad Ali had become a global icon, he was no longer just a fighter. He was a symbol. World leaders wanted his presence. Corporations wanted his endorsement. Nations wanted his loyalty. Ali's name carried weight far beyond boxing. When he spoke, people listened. When he stood for something, it echoed across borders. That kind of influence doesn't go unnoticed by power. One of the men who noticed was King Faisal. According to widely told accounts, the king extended an offer almost impossible to comprehend, an astronomical sum reported by many as 100 million, along with a life of unmatched luxury. Private jets at his disposal, palaces to live in, servants, security, and status beyond imagination. But the offer wasn't just about money. Ali was being asked to relocate permanently, to become a representative of the kingdom, and to align himself, quietly and respectfully, with royal interests. There would be no fighting, no physical risk, no public struggle. Just comfort and expectation. Because with that kind of money comes something unspoken, restraint. Silence when silence is convenient. Loyalty when loyalty is expected. Distance from causes that make powerful people uncomfortable. To most people, this was a dream scenario. A reward for a lifetime of struggle, a chance to live without pressure, criticism, or consequences. For many, saying yes wouldn't even feel like selling out. It would feel like finally winning. But Ali understood something deeper. He recognized that this wasn't a business deal, it was a trade. Wealth in exchange for independence. Security in exchange for authenticity. Comfort in exchange for conscience. Ali had spent his entire life refusing to let powerful systems tell him who he could be, what he could say, or what he had to believe. He had already paid enormous prices for that freedom, financially, professionally, and personally. So when the offer arrived wrapped in gold and politeness, he didn't see opportunity. He saw a test. Because the higher the reward, the more dangerous the choice becomes. Most people think pressure forces compromise, but more often, it's reward that does the damage. The bigger the offer, the quieter your conscience is expected to be. Muhammad Ali listened respectfully. No raised eyebrows, no smirk, no ego pushing him to remind anyone who he was. He let the offer sit in the air, heavy with wealth, power, and expectation. Then he spoke. Calmly, clearly, without hesitation, he said he couldn't accept. Not because the number wasn't big enough. Not because the lifestyle didn't tempt him. And not because he failed to understand what was being placed in front of him. He refused because his voice didn't belong to kings. It belonged somewhere else. It belonged to the people who had watched him lose his title for standing by his beliefs, to the young black kids who saw in him proof that dignity didn't have to bow to authority, to the poor, the ignored, the unheard, those who didn't have private jets or palaces, but still deserved representation. Ali knew that his influence wasn't accidental. It wasn't a perk of fame. It was a responsibility. And once a voice like his is tied to power, it no longer speaks freely. It speaks carefully. He understood that accepting the offer wouldn't silence him overnight. It would do something quieter and far more dangerous. It would change what he was allowed to say, who he was allowed to defend, and when he was expected to stay quiet. Ali had spent his entire life being told to know his place, to stay in his lane, to be grateful and obedient. He refused then and he refused now. The room reportedly went still, not because anyone felt insulted, but because everyone understood the weight of what had just happened. A man had been offered everything the world tells you to chase, and had walked away without blinking. This wasn't defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was identity. Ali knew exactly who he was before the world tried to redefine him with money. He knew that once you trade your values for comfort, you don't lose them loudly. You lose them quietly, one compromise at a time. And he wasn't willing to let that happen. Because for Ali, winning had never been about accumulation. It had always been about alignment. Aligning words with actions, beliefs with behavior, fame with purpose. He didn't need a crown's approval to feel powerful. He didn't need permission to be significant. He needed his voice to remain his own. And that, more than 100 million, more than luxury, more than safety, was non-negotiable. Some people become legends because of what they achieve. Others become legends because of what they refuse to surrender. Ali knew the difference. Long before the king's offer ever existed, Muhammad Ali had already proven something rare. He had shown the world where his line was. At the height of his career, young, undefeated, and on top of boxing, Ali was drafted into the Vietnam War. Accepting would have meant safety, praise, and approval from the most powerful institutions in the country. Refusing meant sacrifice, and Ali refused. He was stripped of his heavyweight title. His boxing license was taken away. He was publicly mocked, ridiculed, and labeled ungrateful. For years, he was effectively blacklisted from the sport he dominated. Not because he was afraid, not because he was weak, but because he believed something deeper. A man should never betray his values for comfort. Those lost years weren't symbolic. They were real. They cost him money, momentum, and time he could never get back. They cost him prime athletic years, years other fighters would give anything to have. Ali paid that price willingly. So when the king's offer arrived years later, wrapped in gold, safety, and privilege, it wasn't a new dilemma. It was the same question asked in a quieter voice. This time there were no courts, no prison threats, no public punishment, just luxury, protection, and the promise of an easy life. That's what made it more dangerous. Because hardship tests your endurance, but reward tests your integrity. Ali recognized the pattern instantly. The Vietnam draft had asked him to trade his conscience for acceptance. The king's offer asked him to trade his independence for comfort. Different packaging, same transaction. Ali understood that once you accept money meant to influence your silence, your freedom disappears slowly, not all at once. You begin choosing words carefully, avoiding certain truths, standing down when standing up matters most. And Ali had already decided, years earlier, that no amount of money was worth that trade. In spirit, his answer was simple. I can't be bought. My purpose is bigger than money. That wasn't bravado, it was lived experience. He had already proven he could lose everything and still keep his identity intact. He knew exactly what selling out looked like, and exactly what it cost. Ali didn't fear being uncomfortable. He feared being compromised. That's why the offer never tempted him the way it would tempt others. Because temptation only works when someone still believes comfort is the ultimate goal. For Ali, it wasn't. Purpose was. Freedom was. Being able to look in the mirror and recognize himself was. Most people assume they'll break under pressure, but far more people fail under reward. Pressure forces you to endure. Reward invites you to rationalize. It whispers that you've earned it, that you deserve peace, that one compromise won't change who you are. Ali knew better. He had already crossed fire to protect his principles. He wasn't about to sell them for gold. That was the line he would never cross. When word of Ali's decision spread, disbelief followed. People talked about it in disbelief in locker rooms, boardrooms, and newsrooms. Commentators shook their heads. Fans argued. Critics scoffed. Who walks away from 100 million? In a world where athletes were beginning to chase endorsements, where fame was being carefully packaged and sold, Ali's decision felt almost unreal. Others were signing deals that required nothing more than a smile and silence. Celebrities traded authenticity for access. Athletes softened their opinions to protect their brand. That was the new currency. And yet Muhammad Ali did the opposite. He didn't issue a press release. He didn't turn it into a spectacle. He didn't use it to shame anyone else. He simply walked away. Without blinking. That stunned people more than the money itself. Because Ali didn't reject the offer out of bitterness. He didn't reject it because he despised wealth or success. He rejected it because he understood something most people only learn after it's too late. Money doesn't just buy things. It buys influence. And once influence over your voice belongs to someone else, it never truly comes back. Ali had spent his entire life speaking freely, sometimes at great personal cost. He had challenged governments, traditions, media narratives, and expectations placed on him as a black man, an athlete, and a public figure. That freedom was not abstract to him. It was earned, protected, paid for. Accepting the offer wouldn't have erased his past, but it would have quietly rewritten his future. Every word he spoke would be examined. Every stance would be questioned. Every silence would be interpreted as agreement. Ali knew how that story ended. It ends with someone who still has money, but no longer has authority over their own convictions. The shock wasn't just that he said no. The shock was that he didn't struggle with it. For many people, that kind of wealth becomes a justification, a way to excuse compromises they never thought they'd make. I'll do good later. I'll speak up another time. I've earned this. Ali never allowed himself that logic. He believed that once you justify silence, you start practicing it, and silence, when chosen for comfort, becomes permanent. So while others were calculating endorsements and appearances, Ali was protecting something far more fragile than money, his credibility. That credibility mattered to people who had very little of their own power, to those who saw him as proof that it was possible to stand tall without permission. If Ali had sold his voice, even politely, that symbol would have cracked. And he refused to let that happen. The aftershock of his decision lingered, because it forced an uncomfortable question onto everyone watching. If he could walk away from that, what excuses were the rest of us making? Ali didn't judge anyone for choosing differently. He understood the pressures. He understood the temptation. But he also understood the cost. Freedom isn't loud when you lose it. It fades quietly, one agreement at a time. Ali chose to keep his. And in doing so, he reminded the world of something it often forgets. You can always make more money. You can never buy back your voice once it's been sold. That's why his decision echoed far beyond boxing. Not as a rejection of wealth, but as a defense of freedom. And that echo is still heard today. Decades later, Muhammad Ali isn't remembered for how rich he was. That alone is remarkable. In a culture obsessed with net worth, contracts, and lifestyles, Ali's legacy isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in decisions. In moments when he could have chosen comfort and didn't, he's remembered for what he stood for courage that didn't ask permission, for faith that didn't bend under pressure, for strength that never needed submission to feel legitimate. Ali's story endures because it contradicts the lie most people are taught that success means accumulation, that winning means having more, that power is proven by proximity to wealth and influence. Ali rejected that equation, over and over again. He showed the world that a man's worth isn't determined by what he owns, but by what he refuses to trade away. That identity isn't something you discover after success, it's something you protect during it. The story of the 100 million offer, whether told exactly as it happened or passed down through retelling, endures because it captures something undeniably true about Ali's character. He knew who he was before the world tried to define him. That's why the story resonates even with people who weren't alive during his prime. Because everyone, at some point, faces a version of that same choice, just on a smaller stage. Maybe it's a job that pays well but demands silence. Maybe it's approval that requires compromise. Maybe it's comfort that costs conviction. Most people never face a 100 million test, but everyone faces a moment where values and reward collide. Ali's legacy matters because it offers a blueprint. He reminds us that dignity doesn't come from being chosen by power, it comes from choosing yourself. That freedom isn't something granted by institutions, governments, or kings, it's something you guard relentlessly. Ali paid for that freedom many times over. With money, with titles, with years of his career, with public ridicule. And yet, when history looks back, it's those sacrifices, not the wins, that define him. That's why Ali transcended sport. Plenty of champions were faster. Plenty were stronger. Plenty retired wealthier. But very few left behind a moral imprint this deep. Ali showed that integrity scales. That the same principles apply whether you're facing a courtroom, a government, or a king. That the hardest battles aren't fought in public arenas, but in private decisions, when no one would blame you for saying yes. His refusal became part of his legend not because it made him rare, but because it made him clear. Clear about who he represented, clear about where he stood, clear about what was non-negotiable. And that clarity is what people still recognize today. We talk about Ali not because he was perfect, but because he was consistent. Because his public persona aligned with his private choices. Because the man who spoke boldly was the same man who acted quietly when it mattered most. In the end, Ali didn't just leave behind highlights and quotes. He left behind a challenge. To ask ourselves who we are when the reward is tempting. To decide what parts of ourselves are not for sale. To understand that real power isn't access, it's autonomy. Muhammad Ali knew his worth before the world agreed. And that may be the most valuable thing he ever owned. Money can buy comfort. It can buy access. It can buy silence. And for a lot of people, it can even buy loyalty. But it can't buy integrity unless you're willing to sell it. And Muhammad Ali never was. That's the part of this story that still hits decades later. Not the number, not the king, not the luxury. It's the refusal. Because Ali understood something most people don't realize until after the deal is signed. Money doesn't just change what you can afford. It changes what you're allowed to be. Once you accept a reward that depends on your silence, your independence starts shrinking. Slowly, politely, one reasonable compromise at a time. No dramatic moment, no announcement. Just fewer truths spoken, fewer lines crossed, fewer risks taken. Ali didn't wait for that erosion to happen. He stopped it at the door. And that's why this story isn't really about him. It's about us. Because most of us won't be offered 100 million by a king. But every single person reading this will face a moment where values collide with reward. It might look like a promotion that comes with conditions. A sponsorship that requires silence. A relationship that demands you shrink who you are. An opportunity that rewards comfort over honesty. The amounts are smaller. The pressure is quieter. But the choice is the same. Ali's legacy forces an uncomfortable question. What part of yourself is not for sale? For many people, the answer changes when the price gets high enough. That's not because they're weak. It's because reward is persuasive. Reward tells you that you've earned it, that you've suffered enough, that one compromise won't define you. Ali knew better. He knew that integrity isn't lost in one big decision. It's lost in a series of small, justified ones. And once it's gone, no amount of money can buy it back. That's why his refusal still matters. Not because it was loud, not because it was public, but because it was consistent. He didn't just talk about principles when it was popular. He lived them when it was expensive. And that's rare. We celebrate wealth constantly. We track net worth. We praise success. But history doesn't remember people for what they accumulated. It remembers them for what they protected. Ali protected his voice, his autonomy, his right to speak without permission. He understood that dignity isn't something you gain later. It's something you defend early. That's why his name still carries weight long after the money is gone, the offers are forgotten, and the kings are history. Because in a world where almost everything has a price, he proved that some things shouldn't. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that you should reject money. Not that wealth is wrong. But that values must come first, or they won't survive success at all. So before you scroll past this, before the moment fades, ask yourself honestly, what would you refuse 100 million for? Your voice, your beliefs, your freedom, your self-respect? Because everyone has a number, and everyone has a line. Ali knew his and he never crossed it. If you believe some things are worth more than money, type PRANCILS in the comments, and tell me what would you refuse 100 million for.